I always thought living in a quiet neighborhood meant peace. My land was mine, and I had spent years carefully tending it, planting trees, keeping the grass just right, and even setting up a small garden where I grew my own vegetables. Life was simple, predictable, and calm. Every morning I would step out onto my porch with a cup of coffee, take a deep breath, and just enjoy the silence. It was my escape from the chaos of the world. I liked it that way. Then came Karen, HOA. From the moment she arrived on the scene, everything shifted. She had this aura of self-importance, like she was the queen of the neighborhood, and she took her role very seriously. Her idea of community service involved inspecting every mailbox, every driveway, and even the exact angle of the flower beds. She once told me with absolute conviction that my garden gnome was too whimsical and didn't fit the aesthetic. I laughed at first. I thought, this is harmless, a little annoying, but nothing I couldn't handle. Karen seemed like one of those people who love rules more than actual people. The first time she knocked on my door, I remember thinking it was just another routine inspection. She was smiling, clipboard in hand, that sharp-eyed grin of hers that made you feel simultaneously evaluated and threatened. She started talking about community standards, safety protocols, and something about upcoming improvements to the neighborhood. I nodded politely, smiling, thinking she was just doing her job. I didn't know then that this was the beginning of something far bigger than a garden gnome disagreement. For a while, life continued as usual. I kept tending my land, enjoying the solitude, and occasionally chuckling to myself about Karen's relentless attention to detail. Neighbors would gossip quietly about her over fences, and I'd shake my head with a grin thinking, let her be, it's her problem. But there's always a tipping point, and I should have known Karen had a flair for the dramatic. She didn't do ordinary annoyances. No, she specialized in over-the-top conflicts that somehow always ended with her thinking she'd won. The morning it all started, I noticed something strange. There were workers on the edge of my property digging a trench. At first, I thought maybe it was a utility mistake, a pipe repair, or some routine maintenance. I grabbed my binoculars and watched quietly, hoping it was nothing serious. Then it hit me. The trench was long, wide, and cutting directly across my land, and the pipes weren't water pipes, they were gas pipes. My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Someone was literally running a gas line through my property, without my permission, without any notice. I ran outside, my heart pounding, and tried to stop them. I asked whose permission they had, waving my hands and pointing at the clearly marked property lines. The workers hesitated, but before they could answer, Karen appeared. Of course it was Karen. She had that same smug smile, clipboard tucked under her arm, and somehow she seemed perfectly calm while chaos unfolded on my property. She told me in her cheeriest voice that the work was for the good of the neighborhood, and that I should consider it a minor inconvenience. She waved her hand as if the trench and pipes were as harmless as a garden hose. I was stunned, my mind raced, trying to process what was happening. My property, my rules, my land, and Karen just assumed she could override everything. I felt a mix of anger, disbelief, and panic. This wasn't a minor annoyance, it was a serious violation. I opened my mouth to argue, but Karen didn't wait for a response. She began explaining how she had executive authority as HOA president and how the community would benefit from this gas line. She even used phrases like, "You'll thank me later," and "Don't be difficult," as if she were some benevolent dictator handing down a gift. I realized in that moment that this wasn't going to be easy. Karen had underestimated one thing: I didn't scare easily. I was used to standing my ground, and now more than ever I needed to do it. My mind started racing with questions. How could she get away with this? What legal recourse did I have? And most importantly, how was I going to stop her before it was too late? I took a deep breath, told her firmly that she had no right to do this, and promised myself that I would fight. Little did I know that this clipboard, this simple piece of cardboard Karen clutched with so much pride, would become the symbol of a battle that would push me to the limits. The calm I had once enjoyed on my property was gone. The peaceful mornings were replaced with anxiety, and the quiet that I loved was shattered by the rumble of machinery and Karen's relentless presence. The war for my land had begun, and I had no idea just how far it would go. It started with the smell. A faint chemical tang that clung to the air and made my stomach churn. I stepped outside, rubbing my eyes, and froze. The trench cutting across my property had grown longer overnight. Thick metal pipes lay in it, glinting ominously in the sunlight. My heart sank. At first, I thought maybe it was some mistake by a utility company, a miscommunication, something small that could be fixed with a phone call. But as I got closer, I realized the pipes were gas lines. Real, dangerous gas lines, running straight through my land without a single conversation, notice, or permit from me. My pulse quickened. I felt anger boil inside me, hot and sharp. My land, my property, my rules. And here was Karen walking through it all with her clipboard like a director overseeing a movie where she was the star and I was just a background extra. She smiled at me all sweetness and said, "Don't worry, it's all for the community. You'll see this will improve everyone's lives." I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Improve everyone's lives by trespassing on mine?" I asked. My voice trembled, partly from fear, partly from rage. I could barely believe she had the audacity to explain it like I was being unreasonable. She just tilted her head as if trying to read me and said, "Sometimes you have to make tough decisions for the greater good. You'll thank me later." I wanted to snap at her, to yell, to tell her exactly what I thought of her greater good. But I held myself back. If I acted impulsively, I knew I could lose control and make things worse. Instead, I took out my phone and started documenting everything: photos, videos, timestamps, measurements. Every inch of that trench, every pipe, every glance. Karen gave me her smug expression. I knew I had to be prepared. This wasn't going to be a simple neighborhood argument. This was going to be a battle. As I watched, neighbors began to appear, drawn by the commotion. Some stood behind fences, curious and whispering. Others ventured closer, clearly unsure if they should intervene or stay out of it. I noticed the fear in their eyes, not fear of me but of Karen. She had a reputation for overreacting, for turning small conflicts into dramatic spectacles. And now, as she gestured to the workers and nodded approvingly, I realized she had miscalculated. She had chosen the wrong person to intimidate. The workers paused when I approached again, looking uneasy. They weren't the problem. They were just following orders, probably thinking Karen had the authority to do whatever she wanted. I asked to see the permit. They looked at each other, shrugged, and said they didn't have one on hand. My stomach dropped. No permit, no notice. This was illegal. The weight of it hit me. Karen couldn't just decide to run a gas line through private property. She couldn't just bulldoze rules because she liked the idea of progress. I decided then that I had to confront her head-on. I took a deep breath and walked up to her. "Karen, this is my land. You have no right to do this. Stop the work immediately," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me with a mix of amusement and disdain, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield. "You're overreacting," she said. "This is for everyone's benefit. You don't want to be the neighborhood obstacle, do you?" Her words sent a chill down my spine. She really thought she could bully me into compliance. She really thought rules didn't apply to her. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. "I don't care about your benefit. You are trespassing. You are breaking the law. Stop now or I will get legal help," I said, each word sharp and deliberate. Karen's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Legal threats won't get you anywhere. Sometimes you have to be flexible," she said. Then, as if to remind me who was supposed to be in control, she waved at the workers and said, "Carry on." My mind raced. I felt trapped between anger and fear. This wasn't just about a trench or some gas line anymore. This was about my rights, my property, my peace of mind. I had to think fast. Retreating wasn't an option. Confronting Karen directly was dangerous, but letting her finish would have been worse. I knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. The storm was coming, and I had to be ready for whatever she threw at me next. I knew I couldn't let this go. Karen had crossed a line, and every fiber of me wanted to storm in and demand an immediate stop. But experience had taught me that anger alone wasn't enough to win against someone like her. She thrived on chaos and confrontation. She loved turning small conflicts into dramatic performances where she could be the hero. So I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and prepared for the confrontation. I approached her once again, this time with more determination than fear. The workers were nearby, moving cautiously, clearly aware that tension was rising. "Karen," I said, my voice steady, "you have no authority to run a gas line through my property. This has to stop immediately." She tilted her head, gave me a little smile, and said in that same sing-song tone she always used, "Oh, don't be difficult, you'll thank me later. This is for the good of everyone." I felt my patience thin. "For the good of everyone," I said. "You're trespassing on my land, Karen. You don't get to decide what's good for me or for anyone else without permission." She frowned slightly, the first sign of hesitation I had seen. Then, almost theatrically, she held up her clipboard. "I am the HOA president," she said, "and sometimes you have to trust leadership. You wouldn't want to be seen as the neighborhood obstacle, would you?" I stared at her, trying not to laugh out loud. The audacity, the nerve. She honestly believed that waving a clipboard around gave her the right to bulldoze over people's property rights. I felt my anger rise, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew this confrontation had to be strategic. Yelling wouldn't help. I had to make her understand that she couldn't intimidate me. "This isn't about being difficult," I said, keeping my voice measured. "It's about the law. You are breaking it. You are trespassing. You are endangering my property and potentially my safety. If you continue this, I will have no choice but to involve the authorities." Her eyes narrowed, and I could see a flash of irritation behind that practiced smile. She leaned closer, lowering her voice in a mock whisper as if trying to intimidate me. I've done this for the community countless times. You'll survive. Trust me, you're overreacting. I took a step back, realizing she was trying to push me into reacting emotionally. She wanted an argument, a fight, a spectacle. I wasn't going to give it to her. Instead, I slowly pulled out my phone and began taking pictures and videos of the trench, the pipes, and her presence. Every motion was deliberate, every angle documented. I needed evidence, and I needed to show her that I was serious. The tension was palpable. Neighbors had started to gather, whispering behind fences and peeking from windows. Some were clearly amused, others seemed genuinely concerned. I could feel the weight of their attention, and it made the moment even more intense. Karen noticed them too, and for a split second her confidence faltered. She waved at them as if to say, "Everything is fine, trust me," but her eyes betrayed her worry. Then came the threat, spoken casually, almost offhandedly, but with all the weight of menace. "If you don't cooperate, I will take legal action," she said. My stomach sank. I had been bracing for confrontation, but hearing the words aloud made it real. She wasn't bluffing. Karen was willing to drag me through a lawsuit just to assert control. The thought was terrifying, but I couldn't let fear dictate my next steps. I clenched my fists, trying to calm the surge of adrenaline. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my mind racing through options. Suing me, she thought she had the upper hand, but I wasn't going to let her get away with this. My property, my rights, my peace, it all mattered too much. I knew I had to fight back, but carefully. I couldn't make a misstep. This was no longer just a confrontation in my yard. This was a battle, and the stakes were higher than I had imagined. As I walked back toward my house, I kept my eyes on the trench, the pipes, and Karen. She returned to supervising the workers, clipboard in hand, trying to act like nothing had happened, but I could see the tension in her posture. She knew I wasn't intimidated, and that alone would change everything. I went inside, took a deep breath, and began to research. Permits, property laws, precedent cases, and legal rights, all of it. I was preparing for the storm I knew was coming. By the end of the day, the trench remained, the pipes were still half buried, and Karen smiled, that infuriating smile from the edge of my property. But inside, I felt a spark of determination. She thought she could bully me, but I was ready to fight. And I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The next move would be critical, and I had to be smarter, faster, and stronger than Karen had ever expected. After the confrontation, I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait. Karen had shown me exactly who she was, someone who would bulldoze over rules, laws, and my property just to assert control. The trench, the gas line, the smug smile, it was all proof that she thought she could get away with anything. I needed a plan, and that plan started with knowledge. I spent hours at my kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of papers, maps, and my laptop. I researched property rights, easements, permits, and HOA regulations. Every click and page turn made me angrier. Running a gas line through someone else's property without permission was illegal. There was no way around it, and yet Karen seemed blissfully unaware or unwilling to care. The more I read, the clearer it became. She had made a huge mistake. A very costly mistake. I started measuring the trench, taking notes on the exact boundaries of my property. Every photograph and video I had captured from the confrontation became evidence. The workers had unknowingly helped me build a case just by being on my land. I traced property lines, checked county records, and even looked into who would be responsible if something went wrong. I realized this wasn't just a fight over a trench, this was a fight over my legal rights and potentially my safety. Sometimes I had to stop and laugh, even if it was a bitter, hollow kind of laughter. Karen, with her clipboard and her over-the-top sense of authority, had no idea she was poking a hornet's nest. I imagined her in a tiny hard hat, supervising the workers like a queen on a throne, while the law slowly began to turn against her. It was almost cinematic, except in real life, the stakes were high. One wrong move from the gas company, one spark near those pipes, and it wouldn't just be about property lines. It could be dangerous. Neighbors were still talking. Some gave sympathetic nods, others whispered behind fences, unsure if they should intervene. I didn't mind. In fact, it fueled me. If Karen thought she could intimidate me by being public and dramatic, she had miscalculated. I wasn't backing down, and the more people saw her behavior, the more obvious it became how over-the-top and reckless she had been. I also began researching similar cases. Court rulings, previous disputes between homeowners and overreaching HOAs, and the penalties for unauthorized construction or utility lines on private property. Each case I read was like fuel for a fire. Some had gone disastrously wrong for the homeowner, others ended in massive fines and humiliating defeats for the HOA. It became clear that I had a path forward, but only if I was methodical and patient. Impulsive actions could ruin everything. One night, sitting at the table with my notes and maps spread out like a battle plan, I realized how serious this had become. Karen wasn't just being a nuisance, she was dangerous in her own way. A person who thought rules didn't apply to them could make mistakes that endangered others. The gas line itself was evidence of her reckless disregard. I thought about what could happen if the pipes were damaged, if the trench collapsed, if someone accidentally sparked it. It was terrifying, but it also steeled my resolve. I had to stop her, not just for myself, but for anyone else who might be caught in her schemes. Then came the idea: I needed legal counsel. I couldn't fight this alone. The moment I contacted a lawyer explaining the trespass, the lack of permits, and the gas line running through my land, I felt a small weight lift. My lawyer confirmed what I had suspected: Karen was in the wrong, and badly. She had ignored basic property rights, local building codes, and safety regulations. The paperwork she had waved around so confidently wasn't enough. She could try to intimidate me with threats, but the law was on my side. That night, as I finally leaned back in my chair, I realized the battle was only beginning. Karen's next move would likely be aggressive: lawsuits, complaints, and more threats, but I was ready. I had evidence, research, and legal advice. More importantly, I had determination. Karen may have thought she could scare me into submission, but she had awakened something in me, a fierce protectiveness over my land, my rights, and my peace of mind. Little did I know how far Karen would go, or how intense the confrontation would become in the coming weeks. The gas line was just the tip of the iceberg. The stakes were about to escalate, and the calm I had once cherished on my property was gone for good. The stage was set, the pieces were in motion, and Karen had no idea that the person she underestimated most would be the one to take her down. A few weeks after my research and preparations, the inevitable happened. A thick envelope arrived at my doorstep, stamped and official-looking. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, and the moment I saw the words lawsuit and plaintiff, Karen last name, my stomach dropped. She was actually suing me, the homeowner whose property she had violated. For a second, I just stared at the paper, thinking maybe this was some cruel joke. It was. The lawsuit was real, formal, and terrifyingly detailed. The letter claimed that I was being uncooperative and hindering community improvements, demanding that I pay fines and accept the gas line without question. The audacity made my blood boil. Karen had literally trespassed on my land, laid down a gas line, and now had the nerve to try to punish me for standing up to her. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head in disbelief. She honestly believed the law was on her side. I knew I couldn't face this alone. I called my lawyer immediately, my voice tight with tension, and explained everything: the trench, the unauthorized pipes, the confrontation, the threats. My lawyer listened carefully, occasionally muttering under his breath, then finally said what I desperately needed to hear: "You have solid evidence. She's overstepped and she's vulnerable. We can fight this, and we have a good chance to win." Still, the thought of a lawsuit was terrifying. I imagined the courtroom, Karen draped in authority, her clipboard in hand, acting like a judge before the judge even walked in. The idea made my palms sweat. But at the same time, I felt a spark of determination. She had picked the wrong person to intimidate. I wasn't going to back down. Over the next several days, my life became a whirlwind of preparation. I went back to my property, taking more photos, recording measurements, and cataloging everything the moment it crossed onto my land. Every angle, every detail, every potential violation was documented. Neighbors began watching more closely, some curious, some concerned. I could feel the eyes on me, but I didn't care. Karen had made this public, and now it was time for me to defend myself with facts and evidence. At home, my lawyer and I went over the lawsuit line by line. Each demand Karen made, each claim she asserted, we dissected. Much of it was nonsense, legally flimsy and easy to counter. But we took nothing lightly. I realized this wasn't just a local HOA disagreement anymore. This was a legal battle that could set a precedent, one that might affect the neighborhood far beyond my land. The first day of preparation was exhausting. I spread maps, permits, photos, and video files across my dining table, each piece a piece of armor in the upcoming fight. I felt like a general planning a battle, every move deliberate, every possibility considered. Karen had thought she could scare me with threats and authority. She didn't understand that I thrived on preparation, on strategy, on turning someone else's arrogance against them. Humor kept me sane in the chaos. I imagined Karen in the courtroom, waving her clipboard like a magic wand, trying to make the judge see things her way. I imagined the dramatic gestures, the raised eyebrows, the over-the-top sighs. It made me chuckle, even though the tension was real. She didn't know it yet, but she had become a character in a story that was about to unravel spectacularly. As the court date approached, the anxiety hit me like a wave. I barely slept, worrying about every detail. What if a judge didn't see the obvious violation? What if she tried to twist the story, paint herself as a hero fighting for the neighborhood? The stakes were high. The trench, the gas line, the confrontation, it was all evidence, but evidence alone wasn't enough. I had to be ready to stand, speak, and present it clearly when the time came. And then one morning, it finally arrived, the formal notice of the hearing. The date, the time, the courtroom number, all staring back at me in stark black letters. My stomach churned. Karen was serious, she was ready to fight, and so was I, only I had the law, evidence, and preparation on my side. Karen had the clipboard and her misplaced confidence. The battle lines were drawn, and I knew this was going to be the most intense confrontation of my life. As I looked over my notes one last time that night, I realized how far this had escalated. What had started as a quiet life, a peaceful property, and an overbearing HOA president had become a full-blown legal war. Karen had made a huge mistake, one that would cost her, but I had no idea just how dramatic the courtroom showdown would become. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and steeled myself. The next move was hers, and I knew it would set the stage for a confrontation I would never forget. After receiving the lawsuit, I knew that reacting impulsively would be a mistake. Karen had spent years hunting her theatrics, manipulating rules, and intimidating neighbors. If I wanted to win, I had to be smarter, more precise, and patient. The first step was to counter the lawsuit strategically, turning her own overconfidence against her. My lawyer and I went through every detail line by line. Each claim she made, each accusation, each demand, we dissected it with a fine-tooth comb. It was clear that her case was weak, built on assumptions and her own inflated sense of authority. She had trespassed, ignored permits, and laid a gas line on my land without any legal basis. All the law required was evidence, and I had it: photos, videos, timestamps, property surveys. She hadn't considered that I had documented everything meticulously from the moment I discovered the trench. As we prepared, I couldn't help but imagine Karen reacting when she realized I wasn't intimidated. She had probably assumed that fear would silence me, that her threats and dramatic presence would force me to submit. But here I was, calmly gathering proof, plotting every step, and quietly watching her underestimate me. I almost laughed at the thought, her waving that clipboard, thinking it could protect her from the law. We began compiling a counterclaim. It was precise, methodical, and unyielding. Every inch of my property she had violated was listed. Every action she had taken without my consent was documented. We included references to local property laws and prior court cases where similar violations had been punished. It wasn't just about winning, it was about sending a clear message. My property was mine, and Karen could not override the law simply because she wanted to. While preparing the documents, I revisited the scene of the trench. The gas line still lay partially buried, a silent monument to Karen's audacity. I walked along it, measuring, photographing, and imagining the scenario if something had gone wrong. It was dangerous, and that danger made the situation feel even more urgent. The fact that Karen could be so careless about potential hazards only strengthened my resolve. This wasn't a personal vendetta, it was a matter of principle and safety. Neighbors started taking notice. Whispers spread about the lawsuit and the counterclaim. Some were amused, others genuinely concerned about the audacity of an HOA president laying gas lines through private property. I kept interactions polite, sharing only what was necessary, but it was clear that the neighborhood was watching. Karen's reputation had begun to crack, and that was subtle but important. She could no longer intimidate everyone into silence. My preparation was quietly shifting the balance of power. I spent nights at my dining table, maps, photos, and legal documents spread out like a battlefield plan. Each piece of evidence was like a weapon, every photograph a shield against her theatrics. My lawyer and I rehearsed our approach, imagining how Karen might try to twist facts, paint herself as a savior, and downplay her trespass. I had to anticipate every trick, every angle, every lie she might use in court. The tension was exhausting, but it was necessary. As the hearing date approached, my anxiety mingled with anticipation. I knew Karen would try to turn it into a spectacle, her theatrics designed to intimidate and distract, but I was ready. I had evidence, logic, and preparation on my side. I wasn't going to be swayed by shouting, finger-pointing, or dramatic gestures. The courtroom would be about facts, not fear, and I intended to make sure every fact was undeniable. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I imagined the scene: Karen standing in court, waving her clipboard, expecting awe and submission, while I calmly presented the evidence she had ignored, every violation laid bare. It was almost cinematic, almost satisfying, but I knew reality would demand patience and composure. One misstep, one emotional outburst, and it could all unravel. By the night before the hearing, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion, fear, and determination. Karen thought she had control. She thought she could intimidate me into submission. She had no idea that I had spent weeks preparing, gathering evidence, and crafting a strategy that would make her regret every step she had taken. I went to bed that night knowing that the next day, the confrontation would finally happen, and everything we had worked for would be put to the ultimate test. The storm was coming, and for the first time, I felt like I was ready to face it head-on. Karen's move had been aggressive, reckless, and brazen. My response would be precise, calculated, and undeniable. The courtroom showdown was about to begin, and I wasn't just prepared to defend myself. I was ready to win. The day of the hearing arrived, and my stomach felt like it had been replaced with a swarm of bees. I woke up early, packing my living room, rehearsing everything in my head, every line, every detail, every argument I might need to present to the judge. The trench, the gas line, Karen's trespass, it all had to be clear, undeniable, and impossible to misinterpret. I could feel the tension like static in the air, every sound amplified, every thought sharp. Walking into the courtroom, I immediately noticed Karen. She was standing there, perfectly poised, her clipboard in hand like it was a scepter. She had clearly rehearsed every gesture, every smirk, every dramatic sigh. Her eyes scanned the room, probably expecting awe, fear, or at least submission from everyone present. She didn't notice me. She didn't notice how calm I had become, how prepared, how ready I was to counter every one of her theatrics with facts and evidence. The courtroom itself was quiet, the low hum of air conditioning mixing with the faint scratching of pens. The judge entered and the room settled. I could feel Karen stiffen, her confidence faltering slightly as the reality of the legal process began to replace her imagined authority. She had thought she could intimidate me in her own yard, on my property, but here in the courtroom the rules were different. The judge's gavel, the official tone, the law itself, all of it leveled the playing field. Karen's attorney began, presenting her case with exaggerated urgency, painting her as the hero, the caretaker, the one trying to improve the neighborhood. I listened, my hands folded, taking mental notes. She spoke with confidence, with flair, with that same tone she used in my yard when waving her clipboard. It was almost comical if it weren't so tense. Every exaggeration, every dramatic gesture only made me more determined to counter her claims. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, letting my presence be calm but deliberate. I laid out the facts clearly and methodically. The property lines, the permits, the photos, the videos, the survey results, every piece of evidence placed carefully in the judge's view. I described the trench, the unauthorized gas line, and Karen's repeated attempts to intimidate me. My voice didn't waver. I kept my tone measured, steady, and factual. The courtroom listened. Karen tried to interject a few times, waving her clipboard and raising her voice, but the judge cut her off politely but firmly. As I walked the courtroom through the sequence of events, I could see Karen's confidence beginning to crack. The smugness faded slightly, replaced with frustration. She didn't expect her carefully orchestrated plan to be dismantled with clear facts and documented evidence. Every point I made, every photo I displayed, chipped away at her narrative. She was no longer the dominant presence in the room, she was just a witness to her own mistakes. There was a tense moment when she tried to argue that the gas line was a minor community improvement and that I was being unreasonable. I paused, looked at the judge, and then calmly explained the legal and safety implications. No permits, potential hazards, trespass, clear violations of property law. I could see the shift in the judge's eyes, the weight of logic, evidence, and law outweighing Karen's theatrics. The balance had turned completely. Throughout the hearing, I stayed calm, focused, and composed. My lawyer handled objections, provided references, and reinforced every claim with precision. Karen's theatrics became increasingly desperate, but by this point they were ineffective. The audience in the courtroom, including neighbors who had come to watch, began to murmur quietly, noticing the shift. The tide was turning, and Karen knew it. I could see it in her posture, the way she clutched her clipboard, the tiny tremor in her hands when she realized she had underestimated me. When the judge finally spoke, laying out the verdict, Karen's jaw dropped. Every claim she had made was dismissed, and my property rights were upheld in full. The trench and gas line were confirmed as unauthorized, and Karen's attempts to intimidate me were noted. Relief washed over me, a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. I had stood firm, documented everything, and the law had vindicated me. As we left the courtroom, Karen's expression was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and embarrassment. She had lost, and in the process her reputation had taken a significant hit. Neighbors whispered, some shaking their heads, others smirking at the spectacle she had created. I felt a quiet satisfaction. The battle had been intense, nerve-wracking, and stressful, but it was over. Karen had learned the hard way that authority doesn't trump the law. As I walked back to my car, I took a deep breath, finally able to let go of the tension that had gripped me for weeks. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a reminder that preparation, patience, and calm resolve could overcome even the most dramatic and overbearing opposition. Karen may have tried to scare me, but I had stayed focused, strategic, and unyielding. The storm had passed, and my property, my rights, and my peace were secure. After the courtroom showdown, life slowly returned to some sense of normalcy, but things had changed. The trench was removed, the gas line rerouted by professionals with proper permits, and my land was fully restored. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers about Karen, the overzealous HOA president who had overstepped so dramatically she ended up humiliated in court. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the truth had prevailed. Despite the relief, I couldn't ignore the tension that had built up over the past weeks. Every morning, I would walk my property, checking the boundaries, the fence lines, and the spots where Karen's unauthorized work had been. It was a small ritual, a way of reminding myself that the fight had been worth it. The court ruling wasn't just about winning, it was about reclaiming control over my own space, my own life, and my own peace of mind. Neighbors started approaching me more frequently, some offering congratulations, others simply shaking their heads in disbelief at Karen's audacity. A few confided that they had long suspected Karen's overreach but hadn't wanted to get involved. I listened, smiled politely, and nodded. The drama had drawn attention, but it had also reminded people of their own rights. Karen's loss had become a subtle lesson for the entire community. Authority, after all, could not override law or common sense. I spent some time reflecting on what had happened. In the heat of the confrontation, in the hours of legal preparation, I had learned more than I expected. I learned that staying calm under pressure mattered more than being loud, that preparation, evidence, and patience could outweigh even the most aggressive intimidation tactics. And most importantly, I learned that standing up for yourself was not just an act of defiance, it was a responsibility. My property, my land, and my peace of mind were mine, and I had to defend them, even against someone as relentless as Karen. For her part, Karen tried to regain her composure. She attended a few neighborhood meetings, acting as if nothing had happened, but the effect was minimal. Neighbors no longer looked to her with the same respect or fear they once had. The aura of authority she had carefully cultivated had cracked, and everyone could see it. The courtroom victory had done more than protect my land, it had shifted the neighborhood dynamic entirely. Karen was no longer untouchable. She had learned in the most public way possible that power could not override law or logic. Even so, I remained cautious. Experience had taught me that Karen's personality didn't change overnight. She was determined, persistent, and had a flair for dramatic gestures. I kept my documentation, my property maps, and my evidence handy just in case. But with the immediate threat gone, I allowed myself to relax, to enjoy the peace that I had fought so hard to reclaim. Morning coffee on the porch felt like a luxury once more, a reminder of what I had been protecting all along. Over time, the story of the gas line and the courtroom battle became a sort of legend in the neighborhood. People whispered about it at barbecues, over fences, and in casual conversations. Some laughed at the absurdity, others marveled at the audacity, but most saw it as a cautionary tale. Even the most overbearing authority could be held accountable. I didn't mind the attention. It was a quiet victory, a validation that persistence, preparation, and standing firm could make a real difference. As I walked my property one last time, inspecting the grass, the fences, and the restored garden where the trench had been, I felt a sense of pride. This land was mine, my rights had been defended, my voice had been heard, and the law had sided with the truth. Karen had underestimated me, assumed fear would keep me silent, and paid the price. It was a reminder that courage wasn't loud, it was steady, deliberate, and backed by facts. Finally, I took a deep breath, looking out over my property, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the garden in full bloom. The battle had ended, but the lessons remained. Standing up for yourself was never easy, especially against someone who thrived on intimidation, but it was necessary. I had won, and the peace, quiet, and control I cherished were back where they belonged. Karen's clipboard no longer held power over me. The storm had passed, and in the calm that followed, I felt a quiet triumph. My land was safe, and my victory was complete. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.